Health Matters with me, Dishan Kumar. Today with me is Dr. NORHAYATI HUSSEIN. Thank you,
Hi.
Doctor, for joining us today.
Hi, Dishan.
Doctor, you are the head of the Neurological Rehabilitation Unit of Hospital Rehablitasi, Cheras, correct? And you are the volunteer advisor to NASAM. All right, so let's start off with today's topic, stroke. We're going to not talk more about the medical side, but also we're going to move into more the rehabilitation thing. But let's start off with what happens to your body when you actually have a stroke.
Okay, in stroke, what happens is that the blood supply to the brain gets interrupted or reduced. And we know that the blood supply brings oxygen and nutrients to the brain cells. So when this is actually interrupted or reduced, what happens is that the brain cell will actually die with time, within a few minutes actually. So with the death of the brain cells, you have a lot of impairments that actually happens with strokes. And this is when you get to see people with weakness, difficulty to swallow, difficulty to talk, and a lot of other things that can actually happen depending on where the site of the stroke is.
Okay. Now, talking about stroke, it's actually very interesting because I think every Malaysian has a family member or friend or somebody that we know that actually has this or has been infected by stroke. Now, let's maybe talk about the what should you do when you realize there's something wrong, or is there symptoms and is there something that you can actually detect, like, oh, I'm actually currently having a stroke right now?
Okay, the stroke is such that the symptoms will depend on where the site of the lesion is, but the most common would be weakness, usually one-sided, either the upper limb or the lower limb. It can happen both, in fact. It can be a sudden or it can be a progressive weakness within a few hours or so. That's one. And a person can also have difficulty with communication. So it's either they have loss of words, or what comes out is actually totally different than what they intended to do, or they simply just cannot speak altogether. So that's for a very slurring of speech. You can actually have that. And you can actually see asymmetry, not just the body weakness, but also in the face as well. So when somebody smiles, it might be a slightly different or distorted facial expression. Those would be the common thing. And if you go by the acronym FAST, face, arm, speech, and time, so the face would be asymmetry, arm would be the weakness, and speech would be the difficulty to speak. So those are the common ones, but other people can also present differently. It can be vision, it can be just disrupted or disturbance in the visual field. Probably cannot see half of the visual field. Difficulty with the balance can also be directly due to stroke, which affects the brainstem. So the symptoms and the signs are actually quite vast, but for me, if you go by facial asymmetry, arm or leg weakness, difficulty to speak, visual problems, quite persistent, and the balance problem, that would be one of the most common presentations. And if you have that, by all means, please seek medical advice and medical consultation urgently.
Okay. Now let's move on into, like you said, the challenges. So let's say a person who has stroke, they go through their whole life changes. But what about their family? So how does a family prepare themselves for, let's say, if a family member, or like you said, there's a spectrum of ages. Anybody in a family could get a stroke. So how does a family prepare for that mentally, and also maybe the environment and things like that?
Okay, so what is important is that for the family to actually arm themselves with information, because information is definitely power. And the more you know, the more you can actually expect what will happen, the more you can expect certain complications may actually set in and take certain precautions. And with information, it also comes the information from peer support. So the peer support, like NASAM and other group support as well, is actually very important, because during the phase after a stroke, it will be very challenging, and you would need somebody who is likely to have a similar experience to actually guide you through as well. So that's one. Arm yourself with information and get proper medical knowledge and and have the best medical treatment, because that will actually ensure recovery and progress to actually take place.
Okay. Now moving on into rehabilitation, we want to talk a bit more about rehabilitation, because once the stroke happens, what we used to talk about, the family goes through a lot, and that patient actually going through rehabilitation. Now, how important is the time frame in that? Does the patient need to start going for rehabilitation immediately, or there is it a case by case thing, or usually do you see the patients actually saying that, do they need to have the strong willpower to say, I want to go for rehabilitation, and things like, how does rehabilitation play an important part?
Okay. The unique thing about stroke is that the impairments are actually different. So one person can have different presentations altogether. So in rehabilitation, the ideal would be a multidisciplinary, multidisciplines, because the impairments are so different. It can be because of physical impairment, communication, swallowing, difficulty with swallowing, difficulty with vision, difficulty with balance. It can also affect your continence. It can also affect your psychological. Post-stroke depression is actually very much highly, it's actually very much described in survivors, stroke survivors. So when you have a lot of things that actually come in, rehab, it would be good if the rehab can actually be provided by different personnel with different expertise and disciplines. So that's one. If you're talking about how early it is, the earlier the better. That is, I think it kind of answers itself. The earlier the better. As long as you're medically stable and no contraindications to rehab. So even rehab would have certain levels as well. It could be the high intensive rehab. It could be kind of like a slower stream rehab.
Yeah, it's a case by case.
Yeah, so it's kind of a case to case basis, and it's kind of custom made and tailor made to that particular individual. But yes, earlier the better. But then again, the recovery, there is no magnitude of time in which it limits to say, okay, this is when your recovery stops. The brain can actually recover and regenerate as long as you actually give additional effort, training, intensity, if you're doing very meaningful activities, especially if you're surrounded by stimulating and enriched environment, that will all contribute to recovery. So I wouldn't say there's a time frame to it. It can actually occur and take place even after 6 months or a year. And
so patients who have not been to rehabilitation, let's say for 6 months to a year, they didn't want to, now they say that I want to start doing back rehabilitation, because patients think that, oh, I should have done it at the start and then I have not done it at all. So, but like you said, it's about training your brain again.
Exactly, and it is very much motivation as well. And if you give the right input, of course, case-to-case basis as well, some degree of recovery is always expected. Yeah, it's still very much possible.
So does rehabilitation, the effectiveness of rehabilitation, is it in all stroke patients that they go for rehab and that's when they actually see results, they actually get better with rehabilitation?
They usually will do better with rehab. There is this spontaneous recovery after stroke, okay? That the brain will actually recover to a certain extent. But if you want to have more, you want to accentuate the progress and the process, this is when rehab will definitely be beneficial. It's super important because we do not want just to wait for the spontaneous recovery to happen. We want we want to maximize the recovery, we want to actually gain the maximum potential, and that will be where rehab steps in and provide the impact for further progress.
Okay.